very much. And this is the opening to that game, so you can get a little bit of a feel and flavor for what the aesthetic of this game is like. Let's enjoy. Okay, let's see if we can move this over. Fantastic. We're going to begin exactly on time because the streaming function likes that. So 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Hello, everyone. A very warm welcome to this talk about the stories that anime cannot tell. I'm Sean. And as you might have noticed, this talk is being delivered in English. And the reason for that is that I have traveled all the way from Ireland to be here with you today. And I'm so excited to share this, and I'm going to give a little bit of background about why I wanted to give this talk, and especially to give this talk at Desucon. So the background is that about a decade ago, I started giving a talk on the history and culture of visual novels. And this is about the visual novel genre, so kind of interactive narrative games, often games where the choices that you make can have a really big impact on the story that you experience and the characters that you meet and what's going to happen. And just as a quick check-in, I actually gave this talk at Desucon in 2018. Maybe there's one or two in the audience. Hands up if you were at this talk before. All fresh? That's totally fine too. Okay. Just as a bit of housekeeping, we will definitely be leaving questions for the end if we have time, but this is going to be a packed one, so stay tuned for it. So one of the things that happened in this talk when I was giving it is I made a claim about a particular game when I was talking about all these branching choices and the different versions of the story that you would experience. I made a claim about a game called Rewrite, which is very close to my heart, really, really good story. And I said, this game is not going to get adapted to anime, because the story branches so much, it goes in so many different directions, that it just wouldn't make any sense to adapt it. I felt very confident about that. Well, Key have a bit of a thing about adapting their stories, and they decided to go ahead with it. And you can certainly agree with me that maybe it wasn't a very good or faithful or it wasn't a great adaptation, but they went ahead with it anyway, and so my pride took a little bit of a hit. But the principle of what I was saying, I think, still held true, because there are certain stories, certain narrative structures, which do not lend themselves to being delivered in a linear format like anime. And as another example of this, I would have given the game The Girl That Chants Love at the Edge of the World. This is a game where not only does the story branch very significantly, but there's a whole puzzle adventure element to this game. And so not only are there lots of branches, but to solve the puzzles, you actually have to jump between the branches in different ways to get a cohesive ending. And so it's really very non-linear. There's no way this game would be adapted. And in particular, like, this is a game from 1995, so like nobody's going to come. No, nobody's going to. They ended up adapting it. And just for the sake of me keeping my train of thought, please do keep quiet during this one, because I've got a lot to try and get across real quick. So they ended up adapting it, and it was to do with the 20th anniversary version of the game. And then they're like, oh, well, the game's doing well. We'll adapt that game. So I guess they didn't adapt the original, but they did an adaptation. And once again, my pride took a bruising. Oh, I thought, if I'm the kind of person who's giving talks about this genre, I should probably take a position on this. So I'm taking a position. There's a game that they're not going to make an anime of. There's one game, no adaptation. Not coming, not happening at all. I'm staking my pride on this one. That game is called IO Revision 2. And this talk is me making the case for why they're not going to adapt this. I think it's a strong case. You can be the judge of it in the end, but this is what I'm coming in with. And during this talk, what I'm going to do is explain in about 20 minutes, here's kind of the plot of IO, so that you get a sense of this is what the story is like and how it all fits together. We're going to have to learn a couple of the key concepts so that the next piece makes sense, which is around digesting the narrative structure, which is, in my view, incredibly fascinating and just beautifully ambitious. I wish I could be making games that are as just shooting for the sky as IO. It's incredible. And I'm going to have to skip so much of the story and characters just to get the core ideas across, because it's a really rich and in-depth experience. As a little bit of content warning, there is a little bit of violence and blood. It is a teen-rated game, so nothing too out of the ordinary. If you have an issue with cyberpunk, symbolism, mythology, or metaphysics, you're in the wrong room, because we're going to get into a little bit of that. But it's going to be good fun. So I'm going to get started just by going through a bit of the story. The story of IO begins with this feeling and sensation of being, like, coming into awareness and being conscious, and you're descending a staircase. And it's a spiral staircase, and you can kind of hear footsteps here and there, but it's almost like you're kind of stumbling through the dark, going downwards, going downwards. It feels like this has been going on forever. And when we look upwards, we glance upwards, we can see that way, way, way up at the top of that staircase, there's an opening out into the sky, and there is a total lunar eclipse. The moon has been dyed red. And we continue stumbling down these stairs, and we get to the bottom, and we come across a mirror. And we look in that mirror, and we see in the reflection. Well, we get to choose who we see in the reflection. This is how IO kind of branches into different routes, and does that very, very early. So we're going to go through the 4 kind of main routes and just explain some of the plot that's going on. And that's going to set us up for that narrative structure stuff later. We're going to start out with Route A. Route A is a route in which we take the perspective of Aoi Hinata. And Aoi is a teenage boy, and he wakes up after a really messy dream where there was this like lunar eclipse, and he was falling through the sky, and he kind of gets out of bed. He's like, I don't know what that was all about. And stumbles, gets up, gets ready for school, and he comes across his father. His father works at this giant corporation called Exarch, and he's not around very much, like he hasn't been home in weeks. They have a very brief interaction, but you get very clearly the sense that he doesn't have a good relationship with his father, and it's a very distant relationship. And the next couple of days involve Hinata kind of getting up and going to school, and just you get a sense of his daily rhythm. There's a few things that we learn. One of those is that he has a very overbearing, clingy childhood friend who wants to be more than friends. But Hinata is about as emotionally detached as his father, and she gets absolutely nowhere with that. Too bad. His classmates are all raving about this new MMO that's come out, and they're all playing it and they're having a great time. In the modern day, we would call this a VR MMO, but this game is set in 2032. So everybody is using BioWare and holograms and all sorts of cool tech to engage with games, and VR would be a very dated term in this era. So they're all playing this game, but Hinata is very insular. He does not connect or feel connected with other people. He spends his time doing crosswords in class. It's kind of archaic, but hey, maybe that's what he grew up with. Also, there are a few other students in the school, so we come across this pair of twins who are in another class, and Hinata bumps into them from time to time, but doesn't really know what to make of them. So another thing to say of Hinata is it isn't hard to conclude that he is clinically depressed. And he is waking up each day, and what he has to say of the world around him is he just feels disconnected. He does not feel like he's part of things. This just doesn't feel real to him. And at nighttime, he has these strange dreams, like the one about the total lunar eclipse, which did in fact happen that night. And he dreams of his sister. And his sister is trying to tell him something, but he can't really understand what she's trying to say. And the one kind of bright spark or bright light in his experience is the school nurse, who is a chain smoker and perhaps the most relatable adult around. So she kind of connects with him, and when he's skipping class, goes to the infirmary, they talk about things. And I think she does a really nice intervention in kind of helping him to understand where he's at. And he comes to realize that Hinata has been, he's really stricken with grief. His twin sister went missing, and he never even tried to look for her. So he has this kind of guilt that he's carrying, and this was 2 years ago. So with a bit of the school nurse's intervention, he decides, okay, I'm going to try and make a difference and do something about this. So he goes back to his house, and he opens up his sister's room for the first time in years. And in there, he finds the room pretty much intact. He boots up her computer and finds that she has left a message for him. The message is in the form of a crossword, so she definitely knew what her brother likes. And the explanation that's left is the answers lie in Babylon. So this MMO is where you need to look for answers. What ends up happening is when we think of doing a crossword today, I mean, ChatGPT or search would solve that in an instant. But this crossword is quite particular, so it requires specific translations of texts. It requires editions of books. And so Hinata ends up spending quite a bit of time at the school library. One of the twin sisters that he met earlier ends up being quite helpful in this. Mayumi is quite good at this stuff. And there's lots of the Arthurian legends. There's Greek and Roman mythology. There's Babylonian mythology is rampant throughout this game because, of course, the MMO is called Babylon, and they based it on that very heavily. So he starts playing a lot of this MMO and making progress on the crossword. And one of the things that he comes across is this really unusual system that's in the Babylon MMO called the IO system. And it's kind of the AI operating system. And what it does is that when you're playing Babylon, the game kind of records all of the inputs from your BioWare. So it's kind of, this is a wearable device, but it's really connected in with your nerves. So the game learns about you during your playtime, and then it creates a kind of personality that is your shadow, and the shadow goes and does stuff when you're not logged in. And then when you log in later, it kind of gets you up to speed with a really quick replay of here's what your shadow did. And so these shadows are really sophisticated. Like, they've done amazing work because they have such close access to how brainwaves work and so forth. So he notices that's a thing. And also comes across this really strange individual who is driving a supercar and almost runs us over. And they are like very blunt and possibly a sociopath and really not pleasant to spend time with, which seems like a once-off thing. But then Hinata comes across the same person. He overhears a conversation between the same person and the school nurse at his school, and learns that these are both people who were the founders of the game Babylon. So there's a group of people who founded the game Babylon, and these are two of them, and they take the names of Babylonian goddesses. So Anu here on the left, and Enlil here on the right. Playing more of the MMO, he realizes that this game is really a hive of extremism. Like, people are using it to recruit for terrorism. They are using it for dealing narcotics. Like, Babylon is a mess in terms of trust and safety. Like, any trust and safety professional would not be happy with what's going on in that game at all. But ultimately, he solves the crossword. It leads him back to the roof of the school at night, And he finds something there that kind of reminds him of his sister, but he's not sure what to do with it. And then O'Neill shows up and says, hey, you're that guy who's been snooping around. I'm having no more of that. So O'Neill whips out a katana, cuts her stomach open, and leaves us for dead. Now I know what you're thinking. But Sean, that's just a bad end, right? No. That's the good end, officially. Which is a little bit unusual, but the game even confirms it for us. So this is kind of the route map, and in this case, it is the completed route map, because I finished the game. But when you complete the game, you'll see that there's a little kind of, it tells you that the route state is in either 0 or 1, depending on how you finished the route. So even when you finish, you get the route A equals 1, that was the ending, which is kind of striking. And so let's take a moment to reflect on like what's going on in this story that I just shared, and is that something you could adapt to anime? Well, I would say not very easily, because this is a story about a mopey teenager taking weeks to solve a crossword puzzle. I don't know about you, but the anime I watch these days, not like a little bit more active, a little bit more vibrant. There's a lot of cool world building and so on, but the plot kind of goes absolutely nowhere. And the second thing is, this crossword solving is part of the way that the game gets across lots of key concepts that come up later. And the game even has a built-in encyclopedia so that you can click on underlined terms and read all about the different things that are being explored, because there's lots of science and physics and other bits and pieces in there. So because anime is not a self-paced experience, you have to share all the info up front. Whereas a game, it's self-paced, and if someone already knows stuff, they don't have to spend the time reading it up. So it's very difficult to reach a broad audience with an anime without boring the people who know the stuff or alienating the people who don't. That brings us to the end of Route A. So let's hop over to Route B. In Route B, we're going to play as Ishtar. And Ishtar, like that's not her real name, it's her handle, and she was one of the people who worked originally on Babylon. The route opens with this similar experience of there's a blood moon in the sky, total eclipse, falling through the sky kind of dream, but then she wakes up, gets out of bed, and starts getting to work. The story with Ishtar is she used to work on Babylon, the game, but after a couple of people stepped out, she also stepped out, and now she's working in cybersecurity. And she has a little crew around her of people who she's picked up and are working with her. And this is a really nice kind of segment. She's a working adult, she's got an apartment, she's got people she's working with, they get along really well, it's like a little family. They have a fantastic time. At times, Ishtar does feel very lonely, but she knows why. And it's because Ishtar is an imaginary child. And in the world of Io, imaginary child has a very special meaning. So you may know that any portion of a population will tend to have a little bit of genetic variety. So for example, in humans, there's a certain small percentage of people who are left-handed. And that's a great evolutionary trait because tigers can't learn to hunt all of us the same way. At one point, they're going to get caught off guard because that human twists a different way and fights back. Similarly, if you look at bacterial cultures, even if you have a live bacterial culture, there's always going to be a small percentage of that which is dormant. And it's dormant so that if there is a significant shift in temperature and the rest of the culture dies off, that one will start to become active, and then the culture survives as a whole. Imaginary children in the world of Io are a type of person who is hyper-adapted for interfaces and networks. So this is somebody who, in this story, after the year 2010, children who were growing up, like that small portion of the population who had access to networks in an unprecedented way, ended up becoming super dependent on and adapted for networks, to the point where they feel like the real world isn't even real. Virtual is more real for them. So this is Ishtar's way of building a life as an imaginary child. And as a reader, we learn, or can realize pretty quickly, Hinata is also an imaginary child, for sure. This story continues, and there is a really interesting segment where Ishtar is going to help one of the other team members with some programming, some debugging. And Mayumi is doing some programming, and she is having difficulty with a recursive function. A recursive function, for the non-programmers in the room, is when you write a little piece of code, and that piece of code calls itself. And it might call itself and call itself and call itself multiple times. So a simple example of this would be if you wanted to output a piece of text which has the letters I, O, like forever, or for how, like the length of string that you want, this piece of code would do it. And it works on the realization that the IO string of length 5 is exactly the same as the IO string of length 4 with an extra I on the end. So this becomes a very elegant way to be able to write an IO string that would output a 1,000,000 length character string. And you can see it working there. So we start by asking for IO string 5, and that's just the same as IO string 4 plus I, which is IO string 3 plus O, which is IO string 2 plus I, which is IO string 1 plus O, which is IO string O plus I, and IO string O is our ending point. And then the computer can go, okay, I'll return that to this address, I'll return that to this address, I'll return that to this address, and all the way back up. In computing, this is referred to as the stack. So you have to keep track of where all of the memory that you're returning to is. And Mayumi has a difficulty because she's written some software which in theory will work, but it takes a very, very long time. And that's what Ishtar tells her about. They also gossip a little bit about other stuff that's going on in cyberspace. So they talk about He, who's this legendary hacker who lives in the virtual world, and he can hack through anything and get through all the firewalls and whatever else it is. And they also hear a lot about Code. So Code is the name of a cyber terrorist cell that's been causing a lot of frustration around the city and around the world. They're responsible for all sorts of incidents. And because Ishtar and her group are in cybersecurity, they end up having some interactions with Code. They end up planting some spyware on one of the Code members, and they learn about an attack which is going to happen at the data center of Exarch, and they decide, okay, that's bad news, we're going to warn the authorities, let's make sure that doesn't go ahead. Well, they do everything right in that respect, but it turns out that one of their family members is actually in the building on the day. And they have to make a tough call about what are they going to do, because there's a terrorist attack happening, potential loss of a family member, what do you do in that situation? Well, for Ishtar, she consults with the team, and they all kind of come together and say, okay, we're going to try and intervene and get them out. And this is a world where being very effective in the virtual space allows you to do things in the physical space. So they bring along a few pistols that they can get a hold of as like self-defense. They do a bunch of really neat hacking things to try and avoid the combat and like close shutters and so on to try and get the person out. But ultimately, this doesn't end well for them. They show up in the building, and Ishtar watches her teammates go down one by one and then is killed herself. In particular, we meet again Enlil, who's that character from Route A who killed Hinata. Okay, there's quite a bit there. One of the things that definitely comes up in terms of adapting to anime is how often should you kill off your cast? There are definitely shows. I'm sure there would be a show of hands for like, have you seen an episode where people did that? Absolutely, it happens. But this is a story where we spend hours and hours investing in getting to know these characters and understanding their relationships and their dynamics, and then there's a lot of death. That's not an easy thing to pull off in an anime, especially if it's on the basis of seasons, where if you end the season with that, it really questions whether people are going to stick around for the next one. However, this is the way it should be, because these characters are imaginary children, and they feel the virtual is more real than the real. And it actually affects their decision-making and their self-preservation instinct. And so these characters making a bad choice is very consistent with who they are and what the state of the world is. Pretty neat so far. Let's get on to route number 3. And this one's quite a bit shorter, or I'm shortening it, would be a way to put this. So in route D, again, the story begins with this experience of we are this kind of awareness or consciousness, and we're going down these stairs, and we see in our reflection, and we end up taking the perspective of this guy. There's a total lunar eclipse overhead, as usual, and we have in our arms the body of somebody who we have failed to save. They are dead, and there's chaos all around us. There's klaxons going, there's sirens going off. This is calamity, and we are infuriated and filled with grief, and we are going to do something about it. The scene kind of shifts, and what we see is a lot of combat. So this character is well armed, has guns, knows how to use them, and both across real space and virtual space starts just tearing things to shreds. Loads and loads of combat. When we come to, we are recovering in some kind of hotel room or apartment somewhere, and it's pretty clear that we're a very heavily cyberized person. And that's quite rare in this world at this point in time. But we are cyberized, and recovering and somebody's patched us up. And it seems like that person is actually Ishtar. So she shows up in the room and says, hey, you're he, the kind of god of cyberspace, the incredible hacker. And that's a little bit confusing because we also seem to be in the real world. But maybe Babylon is so real these days that it's hard to tell. It's not all that clear. But in any case, Ishtar says that she wants to help. What follows this is a bit of a vengeance streak. So there's a lot of going after Code, which is the terrorist cell that has been causing all these problems. And then there's also recovering. And in the downtime, while he is recovering, he's also exploring cyberspace and getting past firewalls and learning all kinds of interesting info. The important one for our purposes is kind of the story behind Babylon. This is an MMO where its founders originally put it together to meet like-minded people and spend time with others who really want to appreciate virtual space and connection. But it grew so fast because of the influx of imaginary children that they weren't able to keep up with servers. So this corporation called Exarch came in and said, hey, we'll solve that problem for you as long as we can kind of learn from the data that you're getting. And so the company took on Exarch's backing, they got loads of funding, and in particular, Exarch gave them a quantum computer. And that is what's been running Babylon. Well, at a certain point, the people running Babylon, who are kind of a front for Code, decided they don't like Exarch so much and kind of parted ways. So Exarch pulled back their funding, but they couldn't get back the quantum computer because that was a top secret clandestine project and there was no way of recovering that quantum computer without making a big fuss. So Code has access to that. They've been running Babylon with it. And that tells he everything he needs to know about where to hit Code so that it hurts. So he does exactly that. He times it well, he goes in for the kill, and none other than Ishtar is in Code's base and is kind of discouraging him, saying, like, there's no need to go after Enlil, like, Enlil's already dead, stop this. But that just seems kind of weird because Ishtar's actually, like, Code aren't having a problem with Ishtar. It seems like she's on their side somehow. So we just brush past her. We find Enlil, who's definitely not dead. And we defeat Enlil in combat and get her at gunpoint, which is a big win. Is this something that's easy to adapt to anime? Well, I would say that's pretty difficult. And part of the reason is that the pacing is so frenetic in this route. It goes from total chaos, combat, plastic explosives going off, grenades being thrown, to we're sitting in bed, doing loads of research, reading all of this stuff, having conversations. Chaos, combat, guns, and it switches back and forth in a really jarring way. But this is a recurring theme in IO, that when you're reading this route, it is intended to be jarring because the experience of being he is jarring. In the same way that the route for Hinata is a very slow-paced route, but it should be slow because Hinata is like slowly waking up from this state of dreamlike existence where he hasn't really been paying attention to his surroundings, and we follow Hinata as he has that experience. It's also worth mentioning that Route D is quite a bit shorter than the other routes. So again, this doesn't conform to the standard approach in anime, which is to have things in seasons or maybe a film in the middle. Route D would not make a satisfying film. And I don't think it makes a full season either, so it becomes very tricky to adapt this or put this into an anime format in a way that really works. And that brings us over to the last of the four main routes, which is Route C. And here we're going to learn something that starts to unlock and unravel a lot of what's going on in IO. So in Route C, it opens with, again, that same scene, but this time we are not he with somebody dying in his arms. We are taking the role, it seems, of Ishtar. And we're at that scene, we're witnessing it happen, and we watch he go through a whole bunch of his vengeance and violence, and the scene shifts and we're kind of outside, and we approach he and try to interact with him a little bit. He's not talkative, would be one way to put it. And the scene shifts again, and this is where I have to point out the scene shifts thing, because this is something that's happening. It's not just like we skip past certain parts of the story. It's actually like the view kind of goes blurry, and then we resume the narrative at a different point. And Ishtar picks up on this and starts to question it. And what she realizes, based on some specific scenes that she sees, is that she is witnessing events in reverse chronological order. And that is something which she starts to lean into and explore and try to understand better. And the metaphysics behind this, as one of the other characters kind of explains, is that normally when we think about the experience of being in the world, we have to go from past to future. That's just how it goes. But there is the world of quantum physics, and in quantum things work a little bit differently. So if you might know the experiment of Schrodinger's cat, that's where we have a cat and a box. We put the cat into the box and we seal the box. And we can no longer observe whether the cat is alive or dead. Now, normally, if we were speaking English, we would say like, okay, the cat is either alive or dead. But when we're thinking in quantum terms, the cat is both alive and dead until we have observed it and we learn what state it's actually in. So the cat is in a state of superposition. It is both things at once. And what's happening in this story is that the game of Babylon is simulated on a quantum computer. And it is simulating these shadows or these impressions of personalities using quantum. And just like Schrodinger's cat, we don't know what the contents of a quantum mind contain in terms of its knowledge or its experiences or anything else until it has spoken up, until it has shared that knowledge with the world. So what Ishtar realizes is that as long as she doesn't say anything, her travel into the past will continue. And it's all going to be about using these memories from the future at the right moment and be able to intervene and set the state of the world in a way that's much more favorable than what she's just seen, which ended in calamity. So, this is the moment where he has Onlil at gunpoint. And Ishtar is able to, if you play your cards right and you make the right choices, intervene and say, okay, don't kill this person. Here's why. And if that happens, he will turn to us and say, well, hang on, you're not Ishtar. Aren't you Mayumi? One of the twins from earlier that he went to school with. And that is kind of the cliffhanger on which we get to do a little bit of exploration of the narrative structure. So what's going on here is route C is in reverse chronological order, and we can also see that route D was in reverse chronological order. So the experiences of he coming across the end of the world in his view and doing all that fighting, we were presented all that information in the other way. We can say of route C that it's quite difficult to adapt this because doing time reversal over a longer period is not easy to pull off, especially if you're intermingling it with straightforward storytelling. And also the bad ends in route C are really instructive because if you speak up and you say things that are you know to be true, but you're saying them at the wrong time, you get bad ends, which I think is a really clever way to get across the sense of what Ishtar is trying to accomplish. So route C and route D are actually going backwards from a total lunar eclipse. But we know that route A and B start with a total lunar eclipse. And so should route A and route B be there going this way? Well, it turns out that there is a particular thing that we can learn from the Saros cycle, which was the technique developed in ancient Babylonia to predict eclipses. And in Tokyo, in 2032, over the span of a year, there are actually going to be 3 total lunar eclipses. One in April in 2032, one in October, and the one the next April. And so the narrative structure for IO actually has route A and route B are starting with the first total lunar eclipse. Route C and route D are starting with the third one. Those ones are coming chronologically backwards. And there's a point in the middle where the story has not yet been told. That is the bit that we're going to cover now, which is route E, or defrag. So what happens in defrag is relatively straightforward. Hinata, after having been left for dead, wakes up. And he has been turned into a cyborg. Somebody has saved him and given him all the cybernetic parts so that he can stay alive. And he doesn't take this well. It's very frustrating for him to lose most of his humanity. And he calls out to the net with enormous frustration. Like, I want power, I want to be able to do something and enact change. And the god of cyberspace responds to that call. He downloads himself to Hinata's new biocomputer. And now Hinata has a dual consciousness. The same thing happens with Ishtar. or Mayumi. So Mayumi is the sole survivor of the incident with Ishtar and all of her people getting killed. The ghost or the shadow of Ishtar from the game Babylon downloads into Mayumi's biocomputer. So we have a second person who has a dual consciousness. And that consciousness could have some memories from the future, but those would only be revealed when we read and access that memory. And so the game is quite careful around, we don't want to access certain memory space until the timing is right. And that's kind of quantum memory space. So it's pretty interesting. And these two both have a bit of a vendetta against Code and against Enlil, who killed loads of people that they care about. So the two of them team up and decide to go take down Enlil. And that's the moment where Ishtar from the future is going to intervene and stop us, and we end up getting Enlil kind of on our side. And Enlil leads us to the thing that we've been looking for all this time. So Hinata was trying to find his missing sister. Well, Enlil knows exactly where that sister is. See, when Babylon was abandoned by Exarch, and they pulled all that funding, Code had the quantum computer, but they didn't have the resources and the processing power to keep the game running. And Hinata's sister, who loved the game, agreed to use an experimental technology called Enigma. And what Enigma does is it is a pod. You can lower yourself into the pod, and it lets you enter a state where your biocomputer can interface with something else and provides enormous processing power, because the human mind can do all kinds of really, really powerful processing, especially in a state of REM sleep. So Mutsuki is her name. She is currently locked in one of those pods, and she is powering Babylon through her dream. Hinata and Mayumi want to get her out, save her from this fate, because if she stays in there for too long, she's just going to die. And they can find 9 of the 10 passcodes that they need, but they cannot find the 10th passcode. And so they are stuck, because this pod, that's wired right into her brain. You can't just smash this thing open. But what we have is a team of incredibly skilled hackers. So they do something that probably nobody else would even think to do. Hinata and Mayumi and Ishtar, pull out 2 of the other Enigma pods. And they decide, okay, we have a password that we are going to hack. And we're going to do it by entering Mutsuki's dream and finding that password that only she knows, because we're told by the story the final password is in Mutsuki's dream. So they enter the pods and sink into this dreamlike state where they're going to enter Mutsuki's dream. And what happens at this point is that they have this sensation of walking down a staircase, this feeling of not knowing quite who you are and stumbling downwards and having a sense of purpose but not quite knowing what it is, and reaching a certain point and then coming into awareness as one of the 4 characters. So when to describe how this narrative structure works, route A is Hinata, route D is route B is Ishtar, and route C is the shadow of Ishtar being in the body of Mayumi. At the start of the routes, there's a total lunar eclipse, all 4 of the consciousnesses have the eclipse overhead as kind of a common starting point, and that resonance helps them to find the right spot to kind of log in. They take over the consciousnesses, or kind of shadow them and kind of follow them along. They have this experience where they intercept Enlil if they make the right choices. Then they are going to have exactly the same experience of going to this room and finding Mutsuki in a chamber and not knowing what to do. And so they do it again. Each time the characters are kind of living through the story, they come across the opportunity to try and get the password. They can't get the password, so they get into the tank and they go a layer deeper. And so the consciousnesses are splitting and coming to the start of the routes. They go through the routes. They don't find the answer this time, but they're going to go deeper. They go through the routes, and you end up with this kind of incredible and unprecedented way of telling a story. And what's amazing about this is somewhere at the bottom in Mutsuki's dream, they're going to be able to establish contact with her because they've learned enough about what's going on, and Hita is not going to be totally out of it. He's going to have kind of learned a few things from the prior iterations of this, to the point where when Mutsuki appears in his dreams, he can ask her the question, get the passcode. And when he gets the passcode, he can log out, and then when he logs out, he can get Mutsuki out of the pod, confirming that the password works, and then he can log out and get Mutsuki out of the pod, confirming the password works, and log out. And so there's this almost infinite depth, and then going back up to escape from Mutsuki's dream. This is quite incredible because this is how a quantum computer, in theory, works. It works through superposition, which is simulating multiple parallel worlds all at once, and then that collapses into a particular state where we have the right answer. This is a hacking like the world has never seen. What a way to get a password. And so, when it comes to thinking about, is I.O. the kind of story that you could adapt into anime? Well, we've talked through a bunch of different interpretations of why that might or might not be the case. Certainly, we have the extremes around pacing. It's very, very slow. It's very, very fast. It's very jarring. The knowledge expectations are high as a very rich sci-fi story. Killing off the cast is a little bit of a risky thing to do, and time reversal isn't easy to do regularly and for such extended periods. But among all the other things, here's the thing that I think makes I.O. special the most. I don't think it would be quite right to describe I.O. as a linear story. I think at this point that should be clear. I also don't think it would be quite right to describe it as a nonlinear story. Really, the narrative structure of I.O. Revision 2 is best described as the stack of a quantum computer evaluating a recursive function. That's the actual gameplay. That's what we're going through as we experience all these different routes, forward through time, backwards through time, and deeper down the stack, down the staircase. And that is what qualifies I.O. as a story that anime cannot tell. Thank you very much. Somehow, we finished with 5 minutes to spare. Okay, that was a bit of a rush. I was very worried about going over time. We didn't go over time, which means that we have the option for people to put up a hand and ask a question if they're curious a little bit about I.O. or what's going on there. Any takers on that? Yes, sir. Where can you play I.O.? I think if you did a bit of searching on the net, you might find it. So it is a fan-translated Japanese game. I don't think there was necessarily ever an official English release. But it did come out on PlayStation 2, and it's available for PC. So I have not spoiled the entire story. That's the incredible thing. There's so much that has been skipped past and missed just to give you the narrative structure and how that whole thing is working.
Were those major spoilers still?
Pardon?
Were just those major spoilers still, or no?
I would say they are significant spoilers because that's what you have to do to give this talk. But how the rest of this resolves, like there's so many subplots that are not touched on there, and the ending is definitely not covered. So still so much to enjoy. I highly recommend it.
Okay, I'm definitely interested.
Good, good. Any other questions? Here?
Hey, yeah, it was interesting. I noticed that this game not only has like this quantum computing and all this like metaphysical stuff, but it's also it's pretty amazing metaphor for spiritual awakening and ego death. And for example, I made some notes. Like when Ishtar started to like question time, it like linear time. That's like one of the aspects of duality, and Ishtar is the is a symbol and an archetype for duality. So it's basically when Ishtar is dying, that's like duality is dying also.
Duality is a huge theme in this game, and like Ishtar's journey there is based on the Babylonian myth in which Ishtar goes through the 7 gates of the underworld and has to strip off an accessory each time she goes and ends up dying for it.
Yeah, and 7 gates, interesting, like 7 heavens, other things.
Okay.
And also,
If you have a question, deliver the question quickly so that
I'll just make a point real quick. Like, it's interesting when it went down, the quantum computing, like you explained. It's also like going down into the collective unconscious and the ego death, like losing yourself slowly until you look into the mirror and then you become another. But yeah, I guess I didn't have a question, but...
well, thank you for sharing. Any other questions?
Yeah, hello. Would you, or are you a part of the Lem fan club?
We didn't get to talk very much about Lem and Rem in this one. I don't think I'm a member yet. I could be convinced. If there's a Lem cosplay out there, then maybe that'll be the thing that pushes me over the edge. Any final question before we wrap up? We've got about 2 minutes. In that case, I'll use the time to say, this game's amazing. And the amount of richness and depth that went into it is just like incredible. This is a love letter to IO in a format where I get to share something pretty interesting and unique about the game. But I could equally talk about the use of linguistics. One of the things that's just incredible is that the 4 different characters all use the Japanese first-person pronoun in different ways. And that's one of the things that keeps you guessing as to who they are. So you might have noticed in some of the dialogue, the I has a different color. And that's because they're using boku no, ore no, watashi, and atashi differently across the roots. So you really build the impression that these are 4 different people, whereas actually there's a duality going on there. It's also fantastic in terms of just opening your mind to all this science stuff that's really, really well delivered and in so much depth. If there's any Evangelion fans in the audience, I would say it's a good read also for people who like Evangelion. But it sounds like that's about it for today. So thank you so much for joining me. Delighted to have an audience coming over to check out an English panel, which is nice. A little bit of variety. And I hope to see you all again around Desucon and at another panel soon. Thanks so much for being here.